Siege of Volstrom. Narration recording. Take 1. The shaking and nervous attendant approached Grand Commodore Garrion. "Commodore," he said, quivering. "My lord, we have lost connection to the 31st Division. Communication with outposts 24, 25, 28, through 36, 49, and 60. The Commodore stared into the fire within the stone fireplace in front of him. The amber glow reflected off his gold pins, medallions, and gold vest, which was made to look like falling feathers. Thunderous roars could be heard through the tall wood doors leading out to the balcony overviewing the encampment surrounding the Commodore's quarters. "They're here," the attendant squealed. Clutching his data slate, the attendant took one last look at the Commodore, who raised his auto pistol to his head, and firing, the shot made the attendant jolt, in shock. He slowly knelt down, putting his fingers to the gunshot wound, examining the blood on his fingertips. Horns and drums could be heard through the balcony doors, as well as the purring rumble of propellers high above the encampment. The attendant walked towards the balcony doors. Books fell off the shelves around him. As the building shook, a vintage crystal bottle of Amasec smashed as it was shaken off of its table. The attendant reached for the doors with both hands, gripping both handles in each hand. Opening the doors wide, he stepped out onto the balcony. Below, in the encampment surrounding the building, stretching off to beyond the second gate, was a tide of green. Orcs en masse were pushing their way into every area of the encampment. The giant war machines of the orcs rolled, walked, and flew forward towards the encampment, from behind the massive wave of orcs. The attendant curled in a ball, and began to roll back and forth. Siege of Volstrom. A Bloodhound Story. The bridge of the clock tower was dark. All the main lights were disengaged. The green glow of monitors lit the room, giving off a green glow growing on the bridge walls. The ship's agents responsible for bridge controls all worked vigilantly to keep the battle barge's systems in check. The green glow of the monitors shined off of the pale faces, finding its way to rest in the crevices of their faces. The clock tower was in warp space. It had been traveling via warp approximately 17 hours, and was approaching its destination. An automated message started over the ship's intercommunication system. The message began with the sounds not unlike a chime or an instrumental triangle. The chime was followed by an automated voice. "Captain Darnius. Report to main bridge. Captain Darnius," followed by the chime. The battle barge broke out of warp space into real space. Blinding ether light bursted out around the clock tower into the void. The opening to warp space collapsed behind the ship as it emerged into real space. The ether light retracted back into the warp until nothing remained of it. The battle barge then took orbit around the planet adjacent to it. The bridge was bright and active. Bridge attendants and crew entered and exited as orders were issued. A sergeant stood watch in the center of the Cumbus Navigatio, standing proxy for the captain, issuing orders in his stead, while the captain's power armor was refit from the damage done to its right arm and breastplate. "Begin proximity scan," the sergeant ordered. A digital map of the planet and its moon appeared on the bridge main display. Begin monitoring the system for communication. The bridge filled with the sound of vox chatter. Intercepted from the planet, several of the voices were shouting, issuing orders. Other messages were the voices of screaming guardsmen. Louder, rougher voices could be made out, but with so many simultaneously, they would be impossible to decipher. "Clean that up," the sergeant told the bridge serf. "Immediately, sir," the serf replied. The vox communication was reduced to one man, a guardsman yelling frantically. "They're moving over the bridge. What should we do?" the guardsman said, pausing as he waited for orders. "Repeat. We are being overwhelmed by the greenskins at Wellman's Bridge." "Orcs!" the sergeant exclaimed. "I've heard enough," the sergeant said to the serf, who then severed the connection. "Activate the cloaking generator. I don't want us being spotted," the sergeant ordered, staring at the main display showing the planet. The resolution on the display slowly came clearer, showing battle lines. "Sir," one of the serfs shouted. "We've got incoming." The bridge shook and rumbled. Warning sirens blared loudly. The bridge lights shifted down to a darker level. Red warning lights flashed repetitively, illuminating the bridge in a dark red. "Access granted, Captain," a feminine automated voice said from the main bridge entrance terminal. The door opened with a hiss as hydraulic pistons pulled the door open. Captain Darnius entered the bridge, the thick-set door closing behind him. "Report," Darnius shouted, before the ship shook again. 3 Orc cruisers on intercept course, Captain. 1 cruiser is in close proximity. They're firing on us, Captain." "With me, bloodhounds," the sergeant ordered to his marines behind him in the trench. The marines were under heavy amounts of fire from the orcs within the 3 garrisoned buildings in front of them. The area around them was rubble and ruins, the fragmented remainders of the plastcrete buildings which once filled this glorious city. Ultramanda will be under Imperial control again, but not before many lives are lost, and many more buildings razed to the ground. The shooter and big shooter fire was spread out and random, as if many of the orc boys weren't aiming at all, although their firepower was concentrated enough to keep the Space Marines locked down in cover. The sergeant stood up out of the cover and began to run towards the middle of the 3 buildings, barricaded and garrisoned by the orcs. The sergeant began to charge towards the building, his chainsword held overhead, roaring as he ran. This display of courage, or sudden madness, inspired the Marines to abandon their cover and join the sergeant in a seemingly suicidal charge. The buildings were 40 meters away, with a plethora of dangers and obstacles in their way. Exposed to plain sight, the orcs' accuracy improved, becoming less random and more focused upon the combat squad of Marines. Shooter rounds riddled the area around the Marines, their armor taking the brunt of the shots, deflecting off of their power armor like raindrops to water. "Orcs!" the sergeant yelled, as the loud wail of a mob of orcs rounding a corner through a passage in the debris. The orcs ran toward the 5 Marines, choppers made from random loose metal in the form of axes or swords and other twisted shapes of metal, bashed against the walls of debris as they charged. "Let's rip 'em to shreds," one of the orcs shouted. "I want dat one's head," shouted another. The rest screamed a loud "Wah!" capable of terrifying the bravest of heroes. But the bloodhounds were the Emperor's chosen, his angels of death, and they know no fear. The sergeant raised his bolt pistol to the oncoming wave of orcs, firing the bolt weapon into the mob. Each rocket-propelled bolt round found a new home within one of the orcs charging the sergeant. The first shot catching an orc through the mouth, shattering its front teeth, and was sent to the ground by the force of the shot, choking on its own teeth and blood. The orc behind him received a shot in the shoulder, and a second through the side of its head. A third orc managed to reach the sergeant, bashing the helmetless marine aside the head with its twisted and sharp bar of metal, dropping the sergeant to his knees. "Sergeant!" one of the brave marines following the sergeant shouted as he saw him fall. In a fury, the marine pushed past the pair of orcs in his way. He fired his bolt gun into the mass of green. An orc boy leaped off of a high ledge to the marine. He raised his bolt gun to the descending orc, bisecting it from the waist with each bolt round as they shred through the orc flesh. Mere meters away from the sergeant, the marine ran ahead from his brother marines. 2 orcs separated the distance between him and the sergeant. Behind the orcs, the marine could see the orc above the sergeant, preparing him for a coup de grace, holding its chopper up high, and the sergeant by the collar. Body-checking the orc to his right, he sent the orc boy toppling over the rubble, breaking several bones in the process. The other orc raised its axe-like chopper over its head, and yelled at the marine. The space marine quickly drew his combat knife from the sheath on his shin guard. He slammed the 2-foot blade down into the left shoulder of the orc, pulling the orc down. The marine then quickly retrieved the blade, then slammed it into the side of the orc's head. The knelt sergeant fired his bolt pistol into the belly of the green beast before him. The bewildered expression of the orc became one of agony in a flash as the sergeant lunged his chainsword forcefully into the open wound in its stomach. The chainsword ripped at the bone and sinew as the sergeant activated the blades of the chainsword. In seconds the orc fell limp, dying on the rotating chain blades. Losing grip of the chainsword, the sergeant fell over to his side. "To me, brothers," the marine shouted, as he began to drag the sergeant into cover behind torn piles of bulkheads. The 3 other marines were advancing toward them, firing their bolt guns into the buildings. The orc fire descended down upon the marines like a thick fog. Kneeling around their wounded sergeant, the marines took to the cover. "Take this," the sergeant said to his savior, handing over the bolt pistol to the marine. "And may," the sergeant said before he began to cough up blood. Clearing his throat, he continued, "May the Emperor guide your hands." The marine accepted the pistol reluctantly, holding it in his free hand. The sergeant pulled out a frag grenade from a pouch at his waist. "Go. There's an underground passage through those ruins." The sergeant rose to his feet, blood slowly sliding down the side of his head struck by the orc. "I saw the orcs using it when they charged us." The marines looked at the breach in the wall of rubble and plasteel. Staring at the bolt pistol in his hand, the marine removed his Mark 6 helmet. "What of you, Sergeant?" You can't expect us to leave you here. The wailing war shout of another wave of orcs filled the air. Remember, brother, the sergeant said, walking towards the war shout. It is better to be crippled in body than corrupt in mind. I will give you the time to traverse the underpassage. You must secure the relic. It must not fall into the enemy hands. The Marines all nodded. Understood, Sergeant, they said. The shouts of an orc mob were close and getting closer with each passing moment. The Marines and Sergeant began to separate ways. Sergeant, the Marine carrying his pistol yelled. The Sergeant turned back to the Marine. The Marine tossed his helmet to the Sergeant. I'll be wanting that back, he shouted with a grin. Shoot-a-fire rained down upon the Marines as they sprinted out from the cover into the small breach in the wall of plascrete and ceramite. 3 orcs guarded the entrance from the underlevel. The orcs all shot up the ramp of rubble at the bloodhound space marines, taking positions aside the entrance. The Marines fired blindly around the corners. One of the Marines threw a crack grenade down into the underlevels towards the orcs. Take cover, the Marine shouted. The 4 Marines retracted back behind the walls as the powerful crack grenade exploded, causing the underpassage ceiling to collapse on the orcs below. The 3 other Marines advanced into the undersystem. The Marine holding the sergeant's pistol looked back to him. A mob of orcs was surrounding his position. The sergeant was wearing the Mark VI helmet, gripping the grenade in his hand. An orc knob shoved its way past the orcs in its way, with one mighty and sacrificial punch to the knob's face. Both the knob and sergeant were enveloped in smoke, dust, and flame of the explosion. No, Sergeant Krieger, the Marine shouted, as 2 of the other Marines pulled him down into the undertunnels. The passage was ruined, walls were blown out, and fires littered the floors, as wall remnants and bodies, both human and orc alike, burned. The area was dark. More than half the lights were broken. The lights that remained were dim and flickered from power surges caused by the orcs. The sergeant ordered us to move on. We must honor him, Darkseer, one of the Marines said to the deputized corporal. The deputized corporal looked down at the bolt pistol he gripped in his left hand and muttered, "You're right." Then, with a newfound confidence in his mission, Darkseer said, "Bloodhounds, sound off." "Herrick's, aye," shouted one of the Marines in Mark VI power armor. "Teredith, aye," shouted another from within his newer Mark VII Aquila pattern power armor. "Darvis, aye," the 3rd Marine shouted. His armor had parts from both Mark VI and Mark VII, as many of the armor parts were interchangeable. "Darkseer, aye," the deputized corporal shouted, followed with, "Bloodhounds, move out." The Marines ran through the dark, destroyed corridors of the underpassage, each step shaking the fragile and crumbling plascrete floors they tread on. Darkseer slowed to a stop, raising his right hand to silently signal to stop. "What is it, Corporal?" Teredith asked from behind Herrick's. "Orcs. 3 of them," Darkseer stated. The corporal tapped his lineman's ear to filter out the noises around him, of the flames, the crackling, and of the warfare overhead. He focused on the sounds of the orcs. "They're 30 meters in the distance, round that corner of the wall." The deputized corporal pointed to a junction in the corridors a few meters away. The Marines approached the torn and burning corner of the wall at the junction. "Darvis, with me," Darkseer said quietly, before quickly sleeking past the corridor's entrance, with Darvis repeating this seconds after. Darkseer peered out into the short corridor. The orcs were in a circle around a fire of burning plascrete, sitting, laughing, and drinking. "The orcs must not have noticed our approach," Darkseer said, leaning back behind the wall. "There is another corridor entrance within that section we could use for cover." "Aye," both Herrick's and Teredith replied. "Also, our exit is directly behind the orcs." Darkseer advanced through the short hallway, trying to stay out of sight when emerging from the other side. Darkseer waited for the other 3 Marines to follow through the corridor before shouting, "Bloodhounds, choose your targets. Do not stop firing until they are dead." The Marines aimed their bolt guns towards the orcs, locking on target with the aid of their helmets' guidance systems. "What was dat?" followed by "Space Marines," echoed down the section toward the Bloodhounds. This was drowned out by the deafening sound of the bolter fire rippling toward the orc boys. The orcs wailed and screamed in pain as the bolt rounds tore through the 2 closest orcs. The third turned around and sprinted up the exiting ramp, catching a bolt round in its lower buttocks. A loud battle cry echoed through the underpassage, drowning out even the thunderous roars of the bolt guns. "Another wave of orcs," Darvis shouted. "Aye," replied Teredith. Darkseer released the depleted clip from the bolt gun that he had held in his right hand. Quickly, he retrieved a fresh one from his pouch. "Reload!" he shouted, as the front of the next wave approached. "That's dem," one of the orcs shouted. "Let's get 'em, boys," another orc yelled. "Move aside," shouted an orc knob in the wave, shoving its way past the smallest orc boys in his way. The knob tackled through the orcs like a battering ram, sending them toppling aside or trampled under its weight. "They are mine," it screamed as it worked its way to the front. Darkseer and Darvis fired their bolt guns towards the orcs. The density from the 2 bolt guns' firepower concentrated on the ramp managed to down 6 of the oncoming orcs. Ignoring the fallen, the orcs ran towards the 4 Marines, each of them holding a unique monstrosity of twisted metal, so large the orcs needed both hands to wield them. The knob held what seemed to be a larger approximation of a chain axe, with some of the teeth replaced with real bone teeth. The orcs shouted a horrific "Wah!" which echoed and grew louder within the chambers underneath the war zone above. Darkseer noticed Herrick's and Teredith weren't firing. Herrick's was searching his pouches for a magazine, and Teredith was struggling with his bolter. "Marines, do you not have ammunition?" Darkseer asked. Herrick's tore off his pouch from his waist after discovering a rip at its bottom. "It must have dropped up at the surface. I'll go back." "No," Darkseer shouted. "Take this," he said, tossing Herrick's the bolt gun. Darkseer raised the bolt pistol in his left hand toward the knob, which was only 3 meters away. He aimed the pistol to the knob's giant head, the knob taking massive strides as it approached him. "We are the Emperor's will," Darkseer shouted before squeezing the trigger, releasing several bolts towards the knob. One of the bolts hit into the knob's horned skull cap, bouncing off its side and rocketing off into the ceiling, creating a crater on detonation. One of the bolts passed through the orc's head from the eye. The third shot tore through its chest. The orc knob fell to one knee, cradling its new chest and head wounds. The deputized corporal took great pride in this moment and ran toward the defeated orc knob. "Darvis," Herrick shouted to the lone marine, "regroup." Darvis continued to fire his bolt gun into the orcs past the knob and Darkseer as he strafed to his right, toward the other two marines. "Teredith, report. Is your firearm malfunctioning?" Darvis said upon reaching them. "Damn thing's jammed," Darvis said, attempting to unlock the weapon. "It won't release." Darvis and Teredith continued to fire their weapons into the horde approaching them, each bolt downing at least one orc as they passed through the green unending tide of orcs. "Yeah!" an orc yelled as it charged past the knob and Darkseer. "Rah!" shouted another, as more and more orcs ran past them towards the three marines. "Teredith, do you still have your combat blade?" "Aye," Teredith said. Looking up from his dysfunctional bolter, he unsheathed the 2-foot knife. "I've got a plan," Darvis said, as he shot down two of the orcs closing in on them. "But we're going to need you standing between Herrick and myself, Teredith. And we're also going to need Darkseer back here." Darkseer looked down to the whimpering knob, placing the bolt pistol against its forehead. "This is for Sergeant Krieger," he shouted. "Darkseer," Darvis shouted, catching his attention. The moment that he looked away and back to the Marines was enough for the knob to take advantage of. With a powerful backhand slam, the knob stood up and launched Darkseer through a pile of rusted metal. "You're dead, Space Marine," the knob shouted as it tore through the pincushion of rusted metal bars. "Teredith, quickly, take my knife," Darvis said, quickly passing him the combat blade. The Marine rested the jammed bolter down, reaching for the combat blade. "You keep them off us, we keep them off you," Darvis said, releasing the knife to Teredith. "Aye," he said, positioning himself in front of the other Marines with a knife in each hand. "Come out here, Space Marine," the knob shouted, as it tore through the pile. Darkseer had dropped the sergeant's pistol upon impact with the pile and was reaching for it through the claustrophobic holes and gaps between the bars. "Got you now," the knob shouted, as it grabbed the pinned Marine by the ankle and began to pull him toward it. Darkseer stretched and reached for the pistol that he was sliding away from. Turning his attention to the knob, Darkseer kicked with his free leg into the orc's groin. "Rarg!" the knob shouted, as it slammed its right foot down into the kicking leg, dislocating it. Darkseer grabbed at the metal around him, but it gave away and broke, or was nothing more than a scrap shard. Grasping at a pipe lodged in the pile with his right hand, he stared up at the orc knob, staring back down at him. The knob yanked on the Marine's leg, lifting him out of the scrap pile. Darkseer used the force and momentum of the orc's pull to slam down upon it with the pipe, thrusting it through the knob's chest. The knob staggered off aimlessly for a moment, then headed back for Darkseer. The knob picked up one of the choppas its fallen comrades had dropped and attempted to yell out another "Wah!" But the most that it made was an odd gurgling noise, and a fountain of orc blood shot out the tip of the rusted pipe. "Darkseer," Darvis shouted again, to the deputized corporal. Darkseer tried walking as fast as he could with the dislocated leg toward the sergeant's bolt pistol, laying just outside the scrap pile. The knob began to pull the pipe out from its chest, dripping with orc blood. The knob tossed the pipe at Darkseer, knocking him forward into the wall. "Damn it," Darvis spat, noticing the orc knob. "You two hold position. I'll retrieve the corporal," Darvis stated. He fired twice with his bolter, then sprinted to the aid of Darkseer. "We must regroup, brother," Darvis said, with his hand extended down for Darkseer. Darvis aimed his bolt gun at the severely wounded knob. "We are his angels of death," he said, firing bolts into the knob's forehead and chest. The detonation left the knob's corpse scattered and torsoless. Darkseer reached over to the drop pistol behind the scraps. Then, slowly standing himself up, he bore his weight onto his strong leg and began to limp back to Teradith and Herrix while firing the pistol into the remaining orcs. Darvis helped Darkseer as a crutch, walking the corporal back, firing the bolt gun in his left hand. "These orcs are unending," Herrix stated. "And ammo is running low." Teradith slammed the combat blade in his left hand down on top of the orc's head, crunching its skull partially into its collar. With a horizontal swing of his right blade, his knife caught another orc by the back of the neck. "We need to move on soon. This is fruitless," Teradith shouted back to the Marines, while applying the boot of his power armor to an orc's chest in a mighty kick. "Herrix, Darkseer," Darvis began. "If we focus our weapons on that promethium piping overhead, we might be able to—" Darkseer raised his pistol to the piping over the orcs. "Just shoot, Darvis," he said, as he fired. Herrix and Darvis both fired as well at the piping. The orcs ran towards the four Marines, uncomplaining but curious as to why the Marines were no longer shooting them. One of the orcs turned around, noticing the bolts were hitting the thick piping. The bolts at first dented the pipe, then managed to cause a breach. One more shot was necessary to ignite the promethium, but the Marines kept firing for good measure into the horde. Flames erupted from the pipe, filling the area underneath it with fire. The pipe burst, causing a massive explosion, collapsing the ceiling onto the orcs, opening up the underpassage to the surface. The smoke and dust began to settle. The blastcrete crumbled to the sides of the hole, giving an exit for the Marines. Flames spewed out from in between the cracks of the rubble. The 3 buildings the orcs garrisoned were in sight from the hole. Shoot-a-fire rained down into the underpassage. "My leg's dislocated," Darkseer said to Darvis. Darvis placed the boot of his power armor onto the Darkseer's boot. He grabbed the marshal's armor by the shoulder and waist with a quick twist and some pressure applied to the boot. Darvis popped the leg back into position. Darkseer took a few steps to test the leg. "We must round the edge of this room to evade the enemy fire." Darkseer ran alongside the edge of the exiting room and began to climb the loose rubble. "With me, bloodhounds." The Marines gripped onto the loose rock wall of rubble, climbing it with as much effort and difficulty of climbing a ladder. Reaching the top and climbing over the edge, Darkseer noticed an orc boy standing a foot from him, bringing a downward swing with its choppa. Darkseer instinctively drew his pistol and dropped the orc with a single bolt to the chest. Darkseer moved on towards the entrance of the building. The door was closed and locked. Herrick climbed out of the hole, accompanied by Teredith, then followed by Darvis. The buildings were mainly brick. A thin layer of plasticrete was molded over top, a final wood finish, to give it an authentic feeling of an aged building. The front entrance was surrounded by 2 columns of pillars, made from the planet's marble. Warfare around them had taken their toll on the pillars. Bullet shells and debris had found their way into the pillars, but miraculously they still stood. The orcs had barricaded the buildings, heavily. All the windows were boarded. Desks and shelves and metal plates were shoved into the windows for protection. Darkseer briefly glanced to his squad. "Bloodhounds, sound off." Much quieter than he said before. Teredith, aye. Herrick's, aye. Darvis, aye. Darkseer, aye, he said before looking back to the door. Darkseer clenched his right hand into a fist and punched a hole through the door, the size of a man's head. The door was blocked by desks, chairs, and bookshelves. Darkseer's arm was caught in the wood. Holding the door with his free hand, he kicked in the door with a massive boot. The door crashed open. The piled-up furniture scattered and slid out of the way from the strength of the kick. The building's interior was trashed. Walls had holes punched through. Pictures of the building's inhabitants were on the floor, smashed and stepped on. A ceiling's chandelier laid smashed in the center of the floor. The Marines entered the building cautiously. There was no sign of orcs present. "Must have been holding out in this hab building," Teredith said, looking down at one of the portraits on the floor. "Very astute, Teredith," Darvis said in a mocking tone. "Did that picture tell you that?" Teredith picked up the portrait by the wooden frame. Corporal Gregor Hanst, a man in his rough 30s. The picture showed donning an Imperial Navy uniform. An Imperial Aquila was stamped in gold on the bottom right of the portrait. "Silence, Darvis," Darkseer ordered. "There are orcs here, but they may have been alerted to our presence." Darkseer began to make his way up the conjoining staircase, climbing the right set of stairs. The corporal glanced back to the Marines for a moment, then said, "Stay cautious. Remain vigilant." The Marines ascended the staircases. Darkseer took point, leading the group from the front. Herrick and Teredith followed him close behind, keeping their backs to the walls as they went. Darvis ascended the left staircase, keeping his bolter locked on the floor above him. The staircases conjoined into a single staircase bridged over the floor below the second floor of the room, a wooden banister railing across the edge. There were 3 doors on the upper level, one opposite the staircase, and the other 2 opposite each other on either side of the landing. "Section secure," Darvis said, as he regrouped with the other Marines, ascending the final set of stairs. The Marines spread out upon reaching the landing. "The orcs are through these doors," Darkseer said, pointing at the center door and nodding toward the other 2. "Herrick, you take the left room. Darvis, take the right. Teredith and I will take the center." "Aye," both Herrick and Darvis said before running to each respective door. Darkseer kicked the door, knocking it off the hinge and shattering it. Darvis tackled his door. His shoulder pad smashed the door. Wood fragments fell from his shoulders as he entered the room. Herrick fired his bolt gun through the door blindly, then bashed the remaining tattered wood away with a backhand swing of his left arm. Darkseer ran into the room headstrong. Orcs lined the windows, firing their shooters out at the windows and all sorts of orc weapons, rigged into them in any way or another. Darkseer ran to the closest orc. The deafening noise of the shooters kept the orcs blind and oblivious to the presence of the Bloodhound Space Marines behind them. Darkseer slammed the orc with a kick, with enough force that the wall gave, and the orc crashed through the wall, falling face first, with the plascrete rubble from the second floor, into the massive hole exposed into the underpassage. Taking notice of the orc beside him falling out of the building, the 4 remaining orc boys turned to see the 2 marines breaching the room. The orc closest to Darkseer charged him with the shooter, using it as a bludgeon. Darkseer quickly raised the bolt pistol, firing 2 shots into the orc's chest, knocking it off balance. Running up to the orc, Darkseer grabbed the back of its head and forced it into the floor. Teradith rushed through the other 2 orcs, running past Darkseer as the corporal pinned the orc under his foot, executing the alien with a single bolt pistol shot through the back of its head. The orcs fired their shooters at Teradith as he charged towards them. The orc's bullets bounced off of the marine's armor when it struck. Fortunately for Teradith, it wasn't much. The marine leapt towards the closest orc, thrusting each knife down in both hands like talons on a bird of prey. The combat knives pierced through the orc through the chest, breaking its ribs. The orc slammed its shooter across Teradith's helmet, denting and scratching it. Teradith pulled the right knife out of the orc, holding it in place with the other knife. With a swift horizontal swing, the Space Marine sliced through the orc's neck, sending it spinning through the air, till it hit the floor and rolled to a stop. Teradith kicked the decapitated orc off his knife, and began to receive gunfire from the last orc boy. At this close distance, the orc's accuracy was close to perfect. Nearly every shot the orc fired landed on the breastplate of the marine. Darkseer aimed the pistol at the orc, but Teradith screened his view. Red flashing lights and warning sirens flared within Teradith's helmet. Breastplate tolerance reaching critical levels, an automated woman's voice said to Teradith from within the helmet. A pictorial readout of the armor appeared on the top left of the helmet's tactical display. The chest section of the readout was an orange-red. Several of the other sections were shown green and yellow, or orange. The orc grinned as each shot from its shooter held the marine in position. A streak of blood from Teradith's mouth splashed against the tactical display as he felt the warm touch of shooter rounds passing through his digestive tract. Armor breached, the automated voice stated. Injecting stimulants, the voice said, as the power armor automatically began feeding his body painkillers and adrenaline. The orc continued to shoot into the marine, who remained standing in the face of danger. The wound in his stomach quickly closed into red scar tissue, the bleeding slowing to a stop due to the Laraman's cells quickly working. The orc's shooter clicked to a halt as its magazine ran dry. The orc frantically dropped to the floor, scrambling for one of the scattered firearms. As Teradith removed his helmet, the orc reached for a salvaged Daka gun resting on the floor. Teradith threw his helmet into the orc, knocking it over. The orc regained its footing and snarled at Teradith after it was back to its feet. Teradith lunged one of the knives like a javelin through the orc, taking the orc once again to the floor. "Room clear, Corporal," Teradith said, before taking a step backward, cradling his wound. Darkseer ran to Teradith's aid, ready to catch his wounded battle brother. "Stand back," Teradith shouted, noticing Darkseer's extended arms. "I need no help," he said as he regained his balance and posture. Teradith gripped his knife tightly in his right hand at his side. He walked over to the dead orc, glaring down at it angrily. Grabbing the handle of the knife that had protruded from the orc's ribcage, he pinned down the orc's head under the foot, crushing the skull as he retrieved the knife. Teradith sheathed the knife in his right hand into his maglock on his right shin guard. Retrieving his helmet, he mag-clipped the helmet to his waist. "Room cleared," Herrick said over the Vox. Darkseer and Teradith could hear him through the inbuilt Vox devices implanted in their ears. Darkseer pressed his gauntlet-covered index finger to his ear, activating his Vox. "Good work, Herricks. Continue on to Darvis's position." Darkseer faced the wall, separating the room that he was in from Darvis. "Teradith, have you any more grenades?" he asked, walking up to the wall. "No, Corporal. I used my last in the underground passage." Darkseer tore his pouch carrying grenades from his shin guard and placed it on the floor against the center of the wall. "Then this will have to do." Darkseer quickly jogged to the center of the room, shouting the words, "Stand clear," as he aimed the bolt pistol toward the pouch. Teradith reacted immediately to the corporal's order, quickly facing away, taking a few paces. The loud crack of the bolt pistol was short-lived and drowned out by the explosion from the grenades. The wall bursted and crumbled into the room in front of them. "Darvis, we're moving in on your position," Darkseer said through his Vox. The corporal ran to the hole left behind the blast, with Teradith following close behind. "Where's Darvis?" Teradith shouted as Darkseer examined the room through the hole. "He should be," Teradith said before being cut off by the massive orc warboss that had just walked around from beside the hole. The warboss's entire body was encased in thick orc mega-armor. Hydraulic pistons moved the giant limbs of the robotic chassis it wore. Its head was large, and its skin was darker than the other smaller, feebler orcs that we had seen. Bionic implants littered the warboss's face. Its left eye was replaced with a bionic lens. Its jaw was metal bent around its face, connected through bolts where its jaw would normally have connected. Its left arm was a claw of blades, connected together through hinges and pistons. The right arm was encased in a large, multiple-barreled big shooter, with ornaments covering it. The warboss reached through the hole with its massive power claw and pulled Darkseer through. "Har, har, har. More space marines to kill," the warboss shouted as it walked into the middle of the room and away from the hole. Darkseer was held up high above the warboss's head. The blades of the power claw dug itself into Darkseer's power armor. Darvis's body laid lifeless on the other end of the room. His armor had been crushed in the waist. Large lacerations covered the armor, some finding their way to the flesh. The back of his head was smashed and torn out. Blood and delicate brain matter dripped and dangled from the exposed section of his skull. "Corporal," Teradith shouted, as he leaped through the hole into the back of the warboss. The pistons strained with the added extra weight of the two Marines, and the warboss began to lose balance. Teradith grabbed at the pipes and exposed cabling with his free hand, hooking onto the warboss with his knife on the other hand. "Get off of me, you git," the warboss shouted, as it tried to shake off the Marine from its back. Darkseer could feel the pressure from the claw rise and lower and dig into the layers of his power armor. Aiming the pistol through the vice grip of the talon-like fingers, Darkseer fired 3 times into the mechanisms of the robotic arm, bending one of the pistons and fracturing the armor. "Rog!" the warboss shouted, as its attention was brought back to the Marine in its grip. Darkseer fired twice more into the arm, piercing it with the second shot. The bolt round exploded within the arm, and its grip loosened. Teradith grabbed one of the pipes connecting from the warboss's back into the shoulder plates of the mega armor. Teradith chopped into the piping, Black greasy oil spurted out onto his face, dripping down onto the breastplate of his red and black power armor. The massive claw fell lifelessly to the warboss's side, dropping Darkseer on his back. Teradith struggled to stay on the back of the warboss as it shook and butted. The warboss crashed its back into the wall, smashing, leaving an indent in the wall of the Marine's backpack. "Corporal, quickly," Teradith shouted. "I can't hold it much longer." Teradith held on with every ounce of strength he had. Darkseer aimed the bolt pistol towards the warboss, taking a few quick shots as he raised it. With one great swing of the orc warboss's weight, it swung the dead claw into the side of the corporal, sending him rolling across the floor. The warboss reached and swung at its own back with its robotic gun arm, taking blind shots as it swung. Striking Teradith with the broad side of the big Shuda across the head, the warboss managed to dislodge the Marine, then turned to face and crush whoever had dared annoy it. Teradith rolled back to his hands and knees, then stood back up ready to fight. Teradith lunged forward to attack the warboss, but was stopped with the four-barreled big Shuda aimed directly towards his face. "You Umis ain't so tough," the warboss said, as it stared through the sights of its big Shuda. "Not as tough as orcs," it continued grinning as it mocked Teradith. "Orcs fight, 'cause we're the biggest. Orcs fight, 'cause we're the toughest. Orcs fight, 'cause we're the strongest." Darkseer rolled over onto his back to see the warboss holding Teradith at gunpoint. "Orcs fight, 'cause we're gonna win." The warboss readied his heavy Shuda at Teradith's face. "Now tell me this, Umi. What do you fight for?" "We fight for the Emperor," Herrick shouted from the hole in the wall. Herrick fired a single shot at the warboss, causing it to step back from Teradith in surprise. "Through arrow we serve," continued to shout as he fired again at the warboss, walking towards it as he spoke. "We are steel, and we are doom," he said, taking another shot at the warboss, catching it in the metal jaw, dropping the warboss to a knee. "We are his angels of death," Herrick shouted, as he drew his combat knife from the sheath at his waist. "His space marines," he said, raising the knife in his left hand, readying it above the warboss's head. "And we shall know no fear," he shouted, as he brought the knife down towards the warboss. With a loud "Rarg," the warboss tackled forward into Herrick's, flailing its dead claw arm as it charged. Herrick's was sent hurtling through the air, several feet from the floor until he crashed into the corner of the room. Teradith leaped once more onto the back of the warboss, hooking his combat knife into the side of the warboss's neck. "Rarg! Get off me!" the warboss shouted, as it began to flail and stomp in a tantrum of destructive force. Teradith drew the other combat knife from the sheath on his shin guard, then quickly slammed the second knife into the other side of the orc's neck. The warboss twitched as the two knives dug and explored the inside of its neck. The orc's mouth filled with frothy blood which dripped from its lips. For a brief moment the warboss seemed to be staring off into nothing before Teradith pulled both knives entirely through the thick green stalk of a neck that the warboss had, dropping its head to the floor. The mega armor stood upright, as it was too heavy and rigid to fall over from the dead orc's weight. Darkseer stood upright and joined his brother Marines. "Darvis?" Herrick asked Darkseer, as the corporal approached the other two Marines. "Dead," Darkseer replied, pointing over to Darvis's body. Herrick looked over to their fallen brother, then looked down to the floor. "We were 3 where we started, on this mission, as 10. Darkseer walked to Darvis's body and knelt over his fallen brother.
We are 3, where 3,000 would fall. We must remain vigilant. Darkseer began searching Darvis's pouches for ammunition or grenades, but they were both absent from the Marine. Darkseer picked up Darvis's bolt gun and released its magazine to check its ammo count. Then, when satisfied with his search, he slammed the magazine back into the bolter. "Looting is beneath us," Herrick said, disapproving. "So are millions of orcs. And between you and me, I'd feel more comfortable bringing this with us," Darkseer said, gesturing at the bolt gun. Darkseer looked up to Teradith. "Put your knives away," the corporal ordered. Teradith resheathed the combat blade into a sheath on his shin guard. "Catch," Darkseer said quickly, with disregard to if Teradith was ready or not, and tossed the bolter to Teradith, who fumbled with it awkwardly before properly catching it. "Now that this first objective has been completed, we will move on to obtaining the relic," Darkseer said, as he strode quickly towards the door leading back out to the main room of the building. Teradith and Herrick followed close behind, taking their last looks at their fallen brother as they left him behind.